The call for help galaxy had entered a new age of warfare for centuries. The Zentari Empire had stood as the unquestionable force in the galaxy. Their armies were vast, their technology unparalleled, and their reach stretched across countless worlds. Yet, despite all their might, the Zentari were now facing an enemy they could not control: the Marauders. The Marauders were a ruthless faction of rebels who had banded together. From various broken empires and war-torn planets, they were fierce, cunning, and willing to sacrifice anything to take down the Zentari. For months, they had struck at the heart of the Empire, cutting through defenses, ambushing convoys, and wreaking havoc wherever they went. The Zentari, for the first time in their history, were losing ground. In the Grand Command Center on the Zentari homeworld, Commander Zarin stood before a massive holographic map. His fingers moved across the air, zooming in and out of the planets and fleets that were under his command. He had been tracking the Marauders' movements for weeks now, and it was clear they were getting closer to victory. Their last strike had taken out one of the Empire's largest supply fleets, leaving thousands of soldiers without food or ammunition. Zarin's mind raced. This wasn't just a rebellion, it was a full-blown war. The Marauders were relentless, their tactics unpredictable. The Zentari had always been the dominant force in the galaxy, but now they were on the defensive, scrambling to keep their empire from falling apart. "This is getting out of hand," Zarin muttered to himself. He turned to his communications officer, a young Zentari named Ruthless. "Send a message to the High Command. We need reinforcements. If we don't act now, we'll lose the entire sector." Ruthless nodded, his face pale. "Yes, Commander, I'll send the request immediately." Zarin looked back at the holographic map, his heart heavy with the weight of his next words. He had led the Zentari forces to victory in countless battles, but this time was different. The Marauders were no ordinary foe. They had shown no mercy, and Zarin knew that without reinforcements, the Empire would crumble. He had to act fast. He wasn't just protecting the Empire now, he was protecting the future of the galaxy itself. The unexpected solution as Zarin's message was sent out, the usual channels of communication remained quiet. The war with the Marauders had drained the Empire's resources, and reinforcements were in short supply. Zarin knew that if they didn't receive the requested help soon, the Zentari would be forced to retreat from multiple key systems, and that would be a blow they might never recover from. But the request for reinforcements wasn't just a call for more soldiers. It was a desperate plea for help from a faction that had long been forgotten by the rest of the galaxy: the Deathworlders, the humans. The term Deathworlders had been coined by the galaxy's more dominant empires as a way to describe humanity. The term was used with a mix of fear and derision. Deathworlders were known for their tenacity, their relentless will to survive, and their unyielding fighting spirit. Humans had endured countless wars on their own homeworld, and despite their relatively small numbers compared to the larger species, they had never backed down from a fight. The Zentari had dismissed humanity for years, seeing them as weak and unimportant. But now, desperate times called for desperate measures. Zarin's request was simple: humanity's greatest strength wasn't their fleet or their weaponry, but their ability to turn the tide of any battle with sheer determination. The call went out to the humans, and an answer came quickly. The response wasn't from the human military that Zarin had hoped for, but from something even more unexpected. The human response would come not with a fleet of ships or a legion of soldiers, but with something much more dangerous: a group of Deathworlders, survivors from the darkest, most violent corners of human history. These were the warriors who had survived countless battles on their homeworld, warriors who had learned to fight not for glory, but for survival. They were mercenaries, hunters, and survivors, and they had only one goal: to protect what they held dear. The message they sent back to the Zentari was simple: "We're coming." Zarin was stunned. He had never imagined that the humans would respond in such a way. He had expected the call for reinforcements to be ignored, but the Deathworlders were coming, people who knew how to fight and win in the most impossible situations. The unleashing of the Deathworlders arrived with little fanfare. There were no grand fleets, no elegant ships carrying hundreds of soldiers. The Deathworlders came in small, rugged vessels that seemed out of place in the clean, precise world of the Zentari. Their ships were patched up and worn, and they carried no banners or colors. They were silent, almost invisible in their arrival, but their reputation had preceded them. As they disembarked, Garin, the leader of the Deathworlders, stood at the front of the group. His eyes were cold, calculating, and his presence alone commanded the attention of every Zentari soldier in the vicinity. Standing just over 6 feet tall, with short cropped hair and a lean, muscular build, Garin exuded an aura of controlled violence. His hands were calloused, scarred from years of fighting. But his most striking feature was the way he moved, like a predator assessing its surroundings. every step deliberate and measured. Behind him, a handful of warriors followed, each one a deadly force in their own right. Their armor was patchwork pieces from countless battles, some scuffed and stained, others barely holding together. These weren't the polished soldiers of the Zentari, nor the well-trained legions of the Marauders. These were survivors, battle-hardened by years of conflict on their own homeworld. Garn approached Zarin with a measured step, his voice low and steady. "We're here now. Tell us where to fight." Zarin stared at the group, his mind racing. He had hoped for something more conventional, but what stood before him was something far more dangerous. The Deathworlders didn't need orders. They didn't need strategy, they simply needed a target. The Deathworlders' air evolved quiet. Tension in the Zentari command center was palpable. Commander Zarin had been waiting for the Deathworlders to arrive, unsure of what to expect. The call for reinforcements had been sent, but the response was far from what he had imagined. The Deathworlders weren't arriving in a grand fleet with high-tech warships or advanced weaponry, like the other galactic empires. Instead, they arrived in a few simple, rugged ships, nothing more than makeshift transports with worn-out metal plating. Zarin watched as the ships descended onto the planet's surface. Their unpolished appearance made them stand out against the sleek, meticulously designed vessels of the Zentari Empire. The Deathworlders had not arrived in the style the Zentari had anticipated, but it was clear that these warriors were not concerned with aesthetics. They came to fight, and their grim determination was evident as they disembarked from their ships. At the forefront was Garin, the leader of the Deathworlders. His appearance immediately struck Zarin. Unlike the well-maintained officers of the Zentari, Garin's attire was worn. His armor looked like it had seen countless battles, each dent and scratch telling a story. His posture was confident and unwavering, and his eyes glowed with a sharp, calculating intensity. He was no stranger to war, and the presence of his comrades reflected the same hardened edge. Behind him, a small group of Deathworlders followed, each of them exuding strength and readiness. They were a mix of men and women, all equipped with various weapons, some standard, others clearly scavenged or adapted from battles fought on their homeworld. The varied nature of their equipment showed no sign of military precision, but rather the resourcefulness born from a lifetime of survival in hostile environments. Zarin's mind raced as he looked at them. He had expected warriors, but not like this. The Deathworlders weren't soldiers in the traditional sense, they were survivors. Survivors of worlds much harsher than any planet the Zentari had ever known. The very idea of relying on such fighters seemed reckless, but there was no time to back out now. The Zentari were losing ground to the Marauders, and the Deathworlders had been their only hope. Garin's gaze met Zarin's, and for a moment there was a silent understanding between the two. This wasn't about pomp or ceremony, this was about getting the job done. No one else in the galaxy had the sheer will to fight like the Deathworlders. *Q called for reinforcements, Garin said, his voice low and steady. "We've arrived." "Where do you need us?" Zarin's jaw tightened. "We've lost the eastern sector to the Marauders. They've pushed through our defensive lines. We need to retake the region quickly before they can establish a stronghold." Without hesitation, Garin nodded. "We'll handle it." His response was short, but the certainty in his tone left no room for doubt. There was no need for elaborate plans or strategies. The Deathworlders didn't need to be told how to fight. They had been surviving, fighting, and winning on their own terms for as long as they could remember. As Garin turned to address his team, Zarin found himself thinking about the gravity of the situation. The Marauders had overwhelmed the Zentari with their surprise tactics, and now their empire was at the brink of losing a crucial sector. The arrival of the Deathworlders had shifted the balance. But the question remained, could they handle the situation, or would the Marauders find a way to outwit them? Zarin knew that the war with the Marauders was no longer just about strength. It was about adaptability. The Marauders had proven that brute force alone would not win this battle. If the Deathworlders were to be successful, they would need to show the Zentari what they had forgotten. Sometimes, true power came from surviving the impossible, not crushing your enemies with superior force. As the Deathworlders moved out toward their positions, Zarin couldn't help but watch them with a growing sense of curiosity. These humans, these so-called Deathworlders, might just be the key to turning the tide of the war. But could they succeed where the mighty Zentari had faltered? The fight for survival war on the front lines was chaos. The Marauder forces had entrenched themselves deep within the eastern sector, a key region that the Zentari had relied on for their supply routes. It was no longer just a matter of losing ground. It was a matter of survival. The Marauders knew how to strike fast, hit hard, and leave destruction in their wake. The Zentari, for all their power, were struggling to adapt. Their military might was no match for the unpredictability of the Marauders, who seemed to always be one step ahead. Garen led the Deathworlders into the fray with the kind of raw intensity that only years of surviving on a hostile planet could provide. They didn't wait for orders or plan their moves meticulously like the Zentari soldiers. They simply reacted. They attacked the Marauders with ferocity, using everything around them as a weapon. A piece of debris became a battering ram, a broken rifle transformed into a club, and an abandoned tank one the Marauders had thought abandoned was turned into an ambush, its hidden crew blasting the Marauder forces with precise, lethal fire. The Deathworlders didn't need to organize their attacks, they were born for this kind of chaos. Their training came from surviving in the most hostile environments, not following rigid military procedures. As Garen led the charge, Zarin watched in disbelief. These were not the soldiers he had expected. They weren't afraid of the odds, and they weren't afraid of the Marauders. They fought with a purpose, driven by an inner fire that Zarin hadn't seen in his own troops in years. One of the Deathworlders, a woman named Jessa, was the first to engage with a Marauder warlord. She was fast, her movements almost animalistic. She ducked under a blaster shot, using the warlord's own momentum to flip him onto the ground, snapping his arm with a sickening crack. The Marauder tried to cry out, but before he could, Jess's blade was at his throat, ending the fight in an instant. Zarin could only watch as the Deathworlders tore through the Marauder lines. It wasn't just their strength or ferocity, it was their adaptability. They knew when to fight, when to hide, when to run, and when to stand their ground. They were survivors. The Marauders had underestimated them, thinking that their brute force and intimidation tactics would be enough to push the Deathworlders back. But they were wrong. In the thick of battle, Garen fought like a predator on the hunt. Moving swiftly through the wreckage of the battlefield, he used the terrain to his advantage, blending into shadows and striking from unexpected angles. His attacks were as precise as they were brutal. He wasn't just aiming to win, he was aiming to make a statement. The Deathworlders weren't here to follow orders or fight like the Zentari. They were here to change the way wars were fought, to show the galaxy that survival came first. As the battle raged on, the Zentari soldiers, who had been watching from the sidelines, began to follow the Deathworlders' lead. They were impressed by the humans' grit, their fearless approach to battle, but even more than that, they were inspired by the idea that survival, not just victory, was what truly mattered. It wasn't about winning the battle, it was about staying alive long enough to fight the next one. But the Marauders weren't about to give up without a fight. As the Deathworlders pushed forward, they ran into a new wave of Marauder reinforcements. The Marauders had realized that their usual tactics wouldn't work against the Deathworlders. They had learned from their mistakes, and now they were adapting, preparing for a fight that would take everything from both sides. The tide of the battle began to shift. The Deathworlders were pushing the Marauders back, but their forces were running low on resources. The environment they were fighting in, streets filled with rubble, buildings reduced to dust, was just as much of a threat as the enemy. Garen knew they couldn't keep up this pace forever. They needed to outlast the Marauders, but that would mean waiting for the right moment to strike a decisive blow. We can't keep going like this, Garen said, panting as he surveyed the battlefield. We need to take control of the supply lines. If we don't, we'll be surrounded, and this fight will be over before it even begins. Zarin, who had been observing from a distance, nodded. You're right, the Marauders are trying to outlast us. They'll use our exhaustion against us. But how do we take control of the supply lines when they're heavily guarded? Garen's eyes narrowed. We don't take the supply lines, we destroy them. We give them nothing to fall back on. The Deathworlders immediately sprang into action. They didn't need a plan, they needed a target. Garen and his team split off from the main fight, heading toward the Marauder supply depot on the outskirts of the city. The rest of the Deathworlders followed, each one with a single goal in mind: to cripple the enemy's ability to fight back. The supply depot was a heavily guarded structure, surrounded by Marauder soldiers, but the Deathworlders didn't hesitate. They moved swiftly, silently, and in perfect coordination, taking out the guards and setting explosive charges at key points in the depot. Within minutes, the entire supply depot was reduced to rubble, and the Marauders lost their most vital resource. The death of the supply lines left the Marauder forces in disarray. They were forced to retreat, their morale shattered. The Deathworlders, on the other hand, were emboldened by their victory. They had shown that with enough determination and the right tactics, even the most powerful enemy could be overcome. Asters, the reckoning. Dust from the battle began to settle, but the aftermath was far from peaceful. The Marauders had been driven from the eastern sector, their supply lines decimated, and their morale shattered. But Garen knew that the Marauders were not like any other enemy the galaxy had faced. They would not simply accept defeat. They would regroup, adapt, and find a way to fight back, just as the Deathworlders had done. As the Deathworlders regrouped after the battle, Garen took a moment to reflect. The success they had achieved wasn't just a result of brute force, it was the result of strategy, unpredictability, and survival instincts. The Deathworlders had turned the Marauders' strength against them, exploiting their weaknesses. They had proven that in warfare, adaptability was often more important than sheer firepower. Garn stood tall in the center of the battlefield, watching as the Deathworlders celebrated their victory. It was strange seeing humans warriors from a far-off world fighting so ferociously, so effortlessly. They weren't just winning battles. They were reshaping the way wars were fought in the galaxy. And in that reshaping, Garn saw something even more profound, the possibility of a new way forward for the galaxy. One not dominated by force and fear, but by cooperation and strength through unity. But as the celebrations continued, Garen's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Commander Zarin. The Zentari leader approached, his face a mixture of awe and disbelief. "You've done it," Zarin said, his voice quiet. "You've turned the tide of this battle. You've proven that humanity's strength isn't in numbers, but in how you fight." Garn met Zarin's gaze, his expression unchanged. "We're not here to prove anything to you, Commander. We're here because we know that in a war like this, survival comes first. And the Marauders would have killed us all if we hadn't done something different." Zarin nodded. "You've earned our respect, Deathworlders, but this battle was just one victory. The Marauders are still out there, and the war is far from over." Garen's eyes darkened. "I know. But this was a crucial step. If we can keep the Marauders off balance, we might just force them into a position where they can't recover." Zarin looked at him carefully, as if weighing his words. "We've been fighting a conventional war for years. We've relied on our strength, our fleets, and our advanced technology. But it's clear now that brute force alone won't win us this war. We need to think differently, and we need allies who understand that." Garn didn't say anything at first. He had never been one to work with others. His people were survivalists, used to working alone, fighting for their own survival. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that this alliance with the Zentari could be something more than just a temporary measure. Together, they could reshape the way the galaxy viewed war and perhaps even change the very foundation of how conflicts were resolved. "Will help you," Garn said after a long pause. "But you'll have to trust us. Our way of fighting may seem unorthodox to you, but it's what's kept us alive, and it's what will keep us alive in the future." Zarin hesitated but then extended his hand. "I trust you, and if this alliance is what it takes to win this war, I'll stand by it. We fight together, or we fall together." Garn shook his hand firmly. "Then we're allies." The unexpected betrayal. As the sun began to rise over the battlefield, the aftermath of the battle was beginning to settle in. The Marauders had been defeated, but their retreat wasn't the end. The Deathworlders, with their unconventional methods, had shown the galaxy a glimpse of what true survival meant. But this victory, however hard-earned, would soon be overshadowed by a betrayal that no one could have predicted. The alliance between the Deathworlders and the Zentari was fragile. Though Garn and Zarin had agreed to work together, there were still lingering doubts between them. The Zentari were not used to thinking outside of their rigid military strategies, and the Deathworlders' wild, unpredictable tactics often clashed with the more calculated approach the Zentari had spent years refining. But just as the first steps of cooperation were being made, a new threat emerged from the shadows. A faction within the Zentari Empire, disillusioned with their current leadership and the heavy losses suffered during the battle, began to plan their own rise to power. These factions saw the Deathworlders as a threat to their authority, and they were determined to eliminate them. In the dead of night, a secret meeting was held. The group, led by a high-ranking Zentari officer named Commander Tarek, discussed their plans to sabotage the new alliance. They believed that if the Deathworlders were removed from the equation, the Zentari could return to their traditional methods of war and rebuild their dominance in the galaxy. Tarek was ruthless, and he didn't care about the cost. He only cared about restoring the power the Zentari had lost in the battle. He would do anything to ensure that the Deathworlders, these wild, unpredictable warriors, were no longer part of the equation. The betrayal unfolds following morning. As Garn and his warriors prepared for the next phase of the battle, they were ambushed. The sudden attack was swift, brutal, and well-coordinated. Garen's team fought back fiercely, but it quickly became clear that the attackers were not Marauders, they were the Zentari. Garen's heart pounded as he watched the betrayal unfold before him. Commander Tarek and his soldiers were everywhere, overwhelming the Deathworlders with their surprise attack. It was not just a fight for survival anymore, it was a fight for their very lives. "Traitors!" Garn shouted, his voice full of fury. "You dare to betray us after everything we've done?" Tarek's voice was cold, his face hard. "You were never meant to be allies. This was all a mistake. The Zentari will never bow to creatures like you." As the fight escalated, Garn realized that the betrayal went deeper than he initially thought this wasn't just a single attack. The entire Zentari fleet was being mobilized to eliminate the Deathworlders, and soon, the alliance with the Zentari would be shattered. The breaking point battle had escalated far beyond what Garen had ever anticipated. The brutal betrayal from the Zentari faction was a shock to everyone involved. What had started as an alliance between the Deathworlders and the Zentari had now turned into a full-scale war between former allies. Garen's mind raced as he fought through the chaos, his heart pounding in his chest. The Deathworlders were skilled fighters, but they were outnumbered. The Zentari forces had surrounded them, and the element of surprise had been taken away. The sound of blaster fire filled the air, and the crackling energy of shields clashing with powerful weapons reverberated through the battlefield. Garen led his team with the precision of a predator, cutting through the Zentari soldiers with brutal efficiency, but despite their best efforts, the numbers were overwhelming. The betrayal had been expertly timed, and the Deathworlders found themselves trapped in a war they hadn't chosen. What happened? Kira, who had been fighting alongside them, shouted over the noise of the battle. We thought we had an ally in the Zentari. This isn't what we signed up for. We didn't sign up for anything, Garen replied, his voice cold and calm. Despite the chaos around him, we're here because we do what needs to be done. No one else can be trusted in this galaxy, not even the Zentari. Kira grimaced as she fired another shot, knocking out a Zentari soldier who had gotten too close. Then we'll have to trust ourselves, she said. We can't back down now. Not after everything we've fought for. The Deathworlders, fueled by their survival instincts, continued to fight back, each one using whatever they had to stay alive. Garen led them, his every movement sharp and precise. He knew that this was no longer about the battle, it was about sending a message to the galaxy that the Deathworlders could never be underestimated. If the Zentari wanted to break them, they would have to do so with everything they had. But the betrayal weighed heavily on Garen's mind. He had never trusted the Zentari completely, but he had never expected them to turn on them so swiftly. This was not just a betrayal of the Deathworlders. It was a betrayal of what the Alliance had stood for. The promise of unity between species, of a new galaxy, had been shattered. And Garen knew that the consequences would be far-reaching. The turning point as the battle wore on, Garen's mind wandered briefly to the bigger picture. The Deathworlders had always survived on their own terms, relying on their wits and instincts rather than alliances. Yet, for the first time, Garen had believed in something more. He had thought that with the Zentari by their side, they could truly change the galaxy, create a balance that had never existed. But now, he was forced to accept that peace between species, no matter how idealistic, would always be fragile amidst the firefight. Garen spotted something that made him freeze. Zarek, the Zentari officer who had once spoken with him in private, was at the front of the attacking force, leading the charge against the Deathworlders. Their eyes met across the battlefield, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. Zarek's face was hard, his eyes filled with resolve. He had chosen his side, and now he was carrying out his mission without hesitation. Zarek's expression didn't change. Even as Garen advanced towards him, he knew what was coming. The distance between them closed quickly, and before Zarek could react, Garen was upon him. With a swift movement, he disarmed Zarek, knocking the weapon from his hand. For a moment, they stood face to face, neither speaking, just staring at one another. The weight of what had happened hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating. You didn't have to do this, Zarek, Garen said quietly. We could have worked together. There was another way. Zarek's lips curled into a sneer, but there was something else in his eyes, something that Garen couldn't quite place. The galaxy doesn't change, Garen, he said bitterly. It will never change. You and your people may survive, but you'll always be a threat. The Krogan were right. Deathworlders like you, like us, are too dangerous. We don't need your kind in the galaxy. Garen's jaw tightened as he raised his weapon. Then we'll make our own way, he said coldly. We'll survive without you. With that, he turned away from Zarek, leaving him behind. The battle raged on around them, but Garen knew that this moment marked something much bigger than just a fight for survival. The Deathworlders weren't just fighting to live. They were fighting for their place in the galaxy. The betrayal of the Zentari was only the beginning. Now, it was up to the Deathworlders to show the galaxy who they truly were. Regrouping and reinforcement. As the Deathworlders continued to battle their former allies, they began to pull back, making their way toward the outskirts of the city. The Marauder forces, which had once been the enemy, were now their only potential allies in the fight against the betrayal they had faced. The Deathworlders had proven their resilience once again, but they couldn't keep fighting forever. The loss of the Zentari alliance was a significant blow, and Garen knew that they needed reinforcements. Kira, still by his side, caught up with him as he moved toward the rendezvous point. She was breathing heavily, her face smeared with dirt, But there was a look of determination in her eyes. "What now?" she asked. Her voice steady despite the chaos. "We fight," Garin replied. His voice unwavering. "We survive, and we find a way to make sure that the galaxy knows this war is far from over." Garin knew that there would be no easy solutions. The death of their alliance had put them on the back foot. But he also knew that the Deathworlders would never stop fighting. They had been forged in the fires of war, and they had the strength to stand alone. The galaxy may not have understood them, but it would soon learn that underestimating humanity and its warriors was a fatal mistake. A new Alien-Seth battlefield was littered with the wreckage of war. The fighting had been intense, the air thick with the smell of smoke and the sounds of dying machines. The Deathworlders had proven themselves on the front lines, holding their ground against the treacherous Centauri betrayal and the Marauder forces. But the cost had been high. The death toll was significant on both sides, and the Deathworlders had lost many of their own in the chaos of the battle. Their victories felt hollow amidst the devastation. Garin stood at the edge of the battlefield, his eyes scanning the wreckage. His chest heaved with the exertion of the fight. But his mind was already moving on to the next phase. Despite the victory, there was no time to rest. The Marauders might have been pushed back, but the war was far from over. The betrayal of the Centauri had shifted the dynamics of the battle, but it had also opened up new opportunities. Kira approached from behind, her face tired but resolute. She had seen the toll the battle had taken on the Deathworlders, but she knew that their fight had only just begun. "What now?" she asked, looking up at Garin. He turned to her, his expression hard but thoughtful. "Now, we need to consolidate our power. The Marauders are still a threat, but we have something they don't: freedom." The Centauri were never really allies. They were just another empire trying to control the galaxy, but now we're on our own, and that means we need to rethink everything. Kira nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. The Deathworlders had been a rogue force from the beginning, but now their actions were attracting attention. They had proven themselves in battle. But would the rest of the galaxy see them as a threat or as a force for change? "We can't fight everyone at once," Kira said, looking toward the horizon. "We need to find new allies, other factions who are tired of the same old power struggles. But we need to move quickly. The Centauri won't stop hunting us." Garin's eyes hardened. "And we won't stop fighting. But you're right, we need to build our strength. We can't take on every empire in the galaxy alone." With that, Garin turned toward a small group of Deathworlders who were gathered near their makeshift base. They had secured the area for now, but the tensions were high. They couldn't afford to trust anyone, not yet. The death of their alliance with the Centauri had left them isolated, and Garin knew that the next steps they took would shape the future of the galaxy. The Marauders proposition. As Garin and Kira made their way toward the group, they were interrupted by a familiar voice. It was the leader of the Marauders, the very faction they had been fighting against. The leader, a towering figure named Serax, had been one of the main forces behind the Marauder assault on the Centauri, but now, after the unexpected shift in the war, Serax seemed to be offering something different, something unexpected. "I didn't think I'd be talking to you under these circumstances," Serax said, his voice gruff but respectful. He approached with a small contingent of Marauder soldiers, his eyes locked on Garin and Kira. "But I think it's time for us to have a conversation." Garin's eyes narrowed, his hand instinctively resting on the weapon at his side. "What do you want?" he asked. He had no illusions about the Marauders. They were as ruthless as they were cunning. Serax chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that didn't match the tension in the air. "I'm not here to fight," he said. "I'm here to offer you something. We've been watching you, the way you fight, the way you've handled yourself. You're not like the other empires. You don't bow to anyone, and we respect that." Kira stepped forward, her gaze skeptical. "You expect us to believe that after everything we've been through? The Marauders aren't known for making deals." Serax's eyes softened, a flicker of understanding crossing his face. "We've had our differences, but the truth is we're both fighting against the same thing. The old ways of the galaxy empires that use their power to crush others. The Marauders might have been born from that, but we're not loyal to the Krogan or the Centauri. We're loyal to survival." Garin listened carefully. It wasn't often that an enemy offered an alliance, especially not one that had been a direct threat to his people, but something in Serax's words struck a chord. Maybe it was the recognition that both sides were tired of the endless wars, that they both wanted something different, a galaxy where survival came before conquest. "We're not offering peace, Deathworlder," Serax continued. "We're offering survival. If you're willing to fight beside us, we'll take down the powers that have enslaved us all. The Centauri, the Krogan, they're all the same. They're the ones who've made the galaxy a place of war." Garin looked at Kira, who seemed to be weighing the proposition. Garin knew this wasn't an easy decision, but at this moment, he realized something profound. The Deathworlders were no longer alone in their fight. They were starting to see that the galaxy wasn't just divided between empires and factions. It was divided between those who would fight for survival and those who would fight for power. And Garin, more than anyone, knew which side he wanted to be on. "We'll consider your offer," Garin said finally, his voice measured. "But understand this, we fight for our survival. And anyone who stands in our way will become our enemy." Sarax gave a slow nod, a sign of respect. "I didn't expect anything else." A new path alliance between the Deathworlders and the Marauders was tentative at best. But it was a start. As Garin and Kira stood together, looking out over the battlefield, they knew that the galaxy was about to change. They had survived the worst of it, the betrayal, the battle, the uncertainty, and now they were ready to build something new. The old ways of the galaxy empires, warlords, and endless conquest were beginning to crumble. The Deathworlders had shown that there was another way to fight, one that didn't rely on the power of the old empires. They had shown the galaxy that survival came from unity, adaptability, and strength in numbers. The galaxy might have underestimated humanity before, but it wouldn't make that mistake again. For the first time in a long while, Garin felt the weight of hope on his shoulders. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for something greater, a future where humanity, the Deathworlders, and even the Marauders could rise above the endless wars and build a new galaxy from the ashes of the old. But there was still much to do, and the road ahead was uncertain. But one thing was clear, Garin and Kira had made their choice. They would fight for the future, no matter the cost. The dawn of a new era. Quiet hum of the warship engines was the only sound. As Garin stood on the observation deck, looking out into the vast expanse of space, the battle was over, but the war was far from done. The Deathworlders and their new allies, the Marauders, had taken their first steps toward reshaping the galaxy. But the real challenge was just beginning. They had faced down their enemies, made the hard choices, and proven that survival was more than just brute force. It was about finding a way forward. Together, Kira joined Garin at the observation window, her gaze focused on the stars ahead. "It's strange," she said, her voice soft. "After everything we've been through, it feels like we've only just begun." Garin nodded, his face unreadable. He had always known that survival came with a price. The alliances they had forged with the Marauders were fragile, and they were still facing threats from the powerful empires that dominated the galaxy. The Zentari had been defeated on the battlefield, but they would not stay down for long. The Krogan, the Keltari, and many other factions would soon take notice of the Deathworlders and their new allies. And they wouldn't like what they saw. "The real fight is ahead of us," Garin said, his voice steady. "We've shown them what we can do, but now we have to make sure they understand that we're not here to be controlled. We're here to survive and thrive." Kira looked at him, her eyes filled with understanding. "We can't keep running forever. At some point, we'll have to face the empires. They'll want to bring us down." Garin's jaw tightened, but there was no fear in his expression, only a steely resolve. "Let them come. We've already fought one war, we'll fight another if we have to." As the warship continued its journey toward the next safe location, Garin's mind was already planning their next moves. He knew they couldn't afford to stay in one place for long. The Zentari were just the beginning. Other factions would soon join the fight, either to crush the Deathworlders or to try to use them as pawns in their own schemes. But Garin had no intention of being anyone's pawn. The galaxy had been shaped by empires for centuries, by those who ruled with an iron fist, by those who demanded control over others. But the Deathworlders were different. They didn't seek to control, they sought to survive. They didn't want dominance, they wanted a place in the galaxy, a place where they could live on their own terms. "We can't do it alone," Kira said, reading his thoughts. "We need more allies, more species who want a different future, who don't want to be controlled by the old empires." Garin turned to face her. "And we'll find them. We'll find those who are ready to fight for their own freedom. The galaxy is full of people who've been crushed under the boot of the empires. It's time they knew there's another way to fight." A new threat recesses. Garin and Kira discussed their plans. An alert suddenly blared across the ship's communications system. Garin's hand immediately went to the console, his mind already anticipating the worst. The screen flickered to life, showing a map of the galaxy, with a red blip flashing near the edge of their current position. A massive fleet was on the move, and it wasn't the Zentari, it wasn't the Marauders. This fleet was something entirely different. A deep voice came through the comms, cold and calculating. "This is Admiral Velder of the Krogan Empire. Your rebellion ends here." Garin's heart sank. The Krogan, they had waited for this moment. The Deathworlders had become a threat to their dominance, and now the Krogan were moving to eliminate them once and for all. "We don't have much time," Kira said urgently, her eyes scanning the map. "They've got a fleet in position. We can't outrun them, we'll have to fight." Garin nodded, his grip tightening on the console. He knew that this battle would be unlike anything they had faced before. The Krogan were not the Marauders, and they certainly weren't the Zentari. The Krogan were a massive military empire, known for their brutal tactics and overwhelming strength. "We'll fight," Garin said, his voice firm, "but we won't fight alone." He turned to Kira, who was already typing commands into the console. "Contact the Marauders, we'll need their ships, and send a message to the other systems. Anyone who's tired of the empires and their endless wars, we need their help." "This is where it all changes," Kira nodded, her face hardening. "With determination, they'll come. We'll show them that the Deathworlders aren't just survivors. We're fighters." As Garin looked out into the stars, he knew that this was the moment that would define their future. The Krogan had declared war on them, but Garin would not back down. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore, it was a fight for the future of the galaxy. The Deathworlders were no longer the galaxy's hidden warriors. They were a force that would reshape everything, but as the Krogan fleet loomed closer, the question remained, could they survive the full might of the galaxy's most powerful empire? And would the alliances they had forged be enough to hold back the storm? The final stand warship engines roared to life as Garin and Kira's forces prepared for battle. The fleet was coming, and with it, a new chapter for the Deathworlders. The galaxy had underestimated them before, but now they were ready to show the galaxy just how dangerous they could be. Garin stepped onto the command bridge, the crew already working in sync to prepare for the impending conflict. The stars outside were no longer just lights in the distance. They were the battleground for the future. "We will make our stand here," Garin said, his voice unwavering, "and when this is over, the galaxy will know our name."